Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. In recent years we have found ourselves living through what I like to think of as the beat 'em up renaissance period, with the likes of River City Girls and Streets of Rage 4 both offering up top level experiences. It really does feel that this genre has returned to its full strength. In today's episode, not only are we going to be looking at another one of the best modern brawlers, but a game that simultaneously seems pretty topical considering what has been in the news lately. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Mother Russia Bleeds, a 21st century beat 'em up where you must take down the corruption of a Russian government. Yeah! Throughout my many years of playing classic beat 'em up arcade games and modern retro brawlers, Mother Russia Bleeds is amongst the most gritty, dystopian and downright disturbing belt scrollers that I have ever laid my eyes on. The game is violent, unsettling and is packed to the brim with political undertones. However, despite all of this, playing this thing instantly conjures up memories of another title that I have experienced in the past. The game I am speaking of, which I played at an earlier date, is an OpenBoR Streets of Rage fan game created in the early 2010s known as Streets of Rage Russia, a controversial, satirical game highlighting many of Russia's politics, whereby the player must defend Mother Russia against the likes of drunks, criminals, ethnic minorities, the LGBT community, alternative lifestylers, certain religious groups, and even Ukrainian nationalists. The game, with its dark satire, features posters of Putin throughout the game's backdrops, and certain versions of the game even allows players to play as Vatnik, a character from a popular meme that circulated around Russia that pokes fun at those who are close-minded enough in the country to steadfastly believe propaganda that is spread by the Russian government and their state-controlled media. Streets of Rage Russia now functions as a piece of political commentary and satirization that has terrifyingly become more relevant than ever before, but in my opinion likely acted as an inspiration behind the game that was to follow, which is of course Mother Russia Bleeds. Mother Russia Bleeds, that acts as a Final Fight and Double Dragon style beat 'em up, shares a lot in common with Streets of Rage Russia, in that both games contain gritty aesthetics, political scenarios, and even some shared settings, such as the fights that take place in a BDSM club that we will later get to. The 2016 game would be created by a French studio known as Le Cartel, a studio that will be partly formed by a game designer known as Frédéric Croisbeau, who left his job working at Ubisoft Paris. The game would be directed by former web designer Alexander Mutoni, with music from an artist known as Florian Renel. In 2014, the first teaser for the game would show off the BDSM nightclub stage, which the team state was heavily inspired by Hotline Miami. Footage of this would quickly spread around the world, building excitement around the game even prior to its release. At E3 2015, the game would be officially announced and would eventually see release for PlayStation 4, PC and later even the Nintendo Switch, meaning there are a number of ways that you can play this high quality affair. Mother Russia Bleeds is set in an alternative 1980s Soviet Union, ruled by a government who are funded and manipulated by the Russian mafia. In this 4-player beat 'em up, you take control of one of 4 Ruska Romani people, named Sergei, Natasha, Ivan and Boris. At the beginning of the game's plot, the foursome work for a man named Mikhail, a man who makes a living by organising street fights in the Russian slums. In fact, gamers get the opportunity to get to grips with the mechanics early on, as you take on wave after wave of low-level opponents in an arena as locals cheer on the violence. The fun is spoiled though pretty swiftly, as government forces wearing bulletproof armour and carrying shields surround the player character and brutalise them until they fall completely unconscious. When the character, or characters if you're playing cooperatively, awaken, the first proper stage in the game begins. After gaining consciousness, it quickly becomes clear that the Romani have been thrown into a government-owned laboratory, with staff members revealing to the playable characters that they are being used as guinea pigs for a concoction of a highly addictive injectable substance known as Necro. Enraged by what has happened, the character you control wants to take revenge on who has done this to them, meaning the first stage consists of making your way through the lab and killing any security and scientists that stand in your way. Before we talk more about this disturbing adventure, let's touch on the mechanics. In terms of the fighting itself, we get to utilise a lot of standard beat 'em up manoeuvres, jumps, punches, kicks, and combining buttons allows for very simplistic combos. The most notable departure from the norm though relates to the fact that you control a character who has become dependent on drugs. This means that they regularly experience intense hallucinations that at points can allow them to fight through injuries and give them monstrous strength. In regards to this, players have access to a syringe, which they can have their character inject into themselves to refill their health bar or enter a berserk state. Interestingly, when you knock certain opponents down on the floor, they will enter a convulsive state. During these instances, you can use your syringe to extract necro from them to inject into your own character. This interesting yet disturbing mechanic leads to some novel gameplay, whereby when your character's life bar is nearly depleted, you find yourself desperate to locate your next fix. Pretty immersive stuff really. The game has melee weapons aplenty, which are extremely satisfying to use, with guns, grenades and ammunition to access too, resulting in a beat 'em up which feels far more destructive than most. You really do feel like you are playing in a war zone in this one. Throughout the stages, there is plenty of character dialogue to push the story along, and each of the 8 main stages have their own boss fights, all of which require their own unique strategies to overcome, with a reliance on regular combat being a quick route to the grave. When players reach the second stage, which is located above ground, it is soon learned that they are inside a prison, whereby fellow inmates and later guards must be dispatched of. Backgrounds are detailed with often plenty of stuff going on, helping to further immerse gamers into the game's animated world. When a riot breaks out, for example, the sirens, fires, falling projectiles and blunt objects carried by the enemies all add to the feeling of utter chaos. Taking on the lead guard at the end of a stage also results in an exciting encounter whereby you have to aim with a gun and you must line up your shots just right before he shoots you first. This game is intense at times indeed. Stage 3 sees the character head back to the source where they were captured by the government to begin with. A search for Mikhail begins, who your character holds responsible for the kidnapping and drugging taking place. Here the scale of the drug problem becomes more apparent as you take on Gopniks and necroheads, male and female alike, even going as far as to take out opponents who are indulging in an illegal drug-fueled rave. The constant air raid sirens, convulsing screens, pace changes in music all add to this game's erraticness and the illusion of hallucinations. It would be an understatement to refer to this murky game as a bit trippy. The whole thing is so dystopian and bloody weird. Stage 3 ends with a boss fight against a gang leader who can satisfyingly be defeated by using a weapon to knock them into a moving vehicle that features spinning chainsaws. The more I played this game, the more I enjoyed it. The tempo is great and every boss battle is drastically different from the next. Moving on to stage 4, you meet up with an NPC who you encounter at the beginning of the game, known as Vladimir, who is heading with a group of other citizens to the city. Vlad is a militant communist who leads a group of revolutionary rebels who assist the player throughout the action of the game. This Che Guevara wannabe features heavily in this 4th stage, whereby he and the group of rebels hijack the train, leading the fights with guards and ultimately against a government official officer. This is an interesting boss fight as both the player and the enemy must avoid oncoming trains, as well as utilising Vlad's flash grenades against the opponent. Defeating this foe is as satisfying as the rest. In the continued hunt for Mikhail, players head to the game's infamous BDSM club stage, where all sorts of freaky goings on are taking place. At one amusing point during this stage, a friendly gimp even decides to submit to the player, making the decision to help fight on your behalf. This is perhaps the strangest and most surreal stage in the game as of yet, and feels more Streets of Rage Russia-like than ever before. Eventually, Mikhail is tracked down, who admits he had no choice but to team with the Mafia and the authorities to hand the 4 Romani over for experiments. He is overall disappointed that the player character or characters have come, because now they are going to be murdered. After this, a huge boss battle takes place against a massive BDSM monster, who if players can evade his attacks, he takes out the gimps along the side of the screen instead, thus meaning you have time to attack him. After that ridiculously strange stage, the stick stage, known as the Revolution, features exactly what the level's name implies, and sees the player brawling through the streets of Russia, taking out the army, government officials and secret police along the way. At one point in this epic stage, you meet Vlad and his rebel forces, who join the protagonist to take part in this epic civil war. Vladimir reveals that the Russian government have completely lost the plot, and everything has gone to hell in the country. According to Vlad, the government even went as far as to use brutality to stop the protest marches in their tracks. Still, in this time of crisis, Vlad quips that his country does not have security forces, only insecurity forces, so it's time to storm the government's headquarters, as Vlad predicts that the Russian government are about to attempt to commit a mass genocide, so they must be stopped to save the civilian population. After witnessing soldiers showing up and starting to beat the civilian population who were protesting, Vlad said you can't imagine the things the group of rebels saw. It was sickening. He reports that this has been enough to push the public over the edge, and downtown has become a battleground between the Russian government and the Russian people. You make your way through the stage, repelling government forces throughout, even gaining the opportunity to wield Kalashnikovs against them. At one point in the stage, you also get to team with a bunch of rebels as you take out riot police, throwing grenades, Molotov cocktails and other homemade explosives, as you try all that you can to stop their march towards you. The stage boss fight takes place against a government official controlling a militarised vehicle, who once defeated allows gamers to move on to stage 7. Here our protagonists enter the underground car park of the government HQ, but it soon transpires that they have been lured into a trap, and an all-out fight takes place. I mean, what else are you going to do within a beat 'em up anyway? Finally, escaping the car park and reaching the outside of the underground entrance to the main building, players bump into Mikhail once more. He reveals that his arm has been chopped off as a result of the playable character standing up to the authorities. Mikhail is furious that the protagonist killed soldiers and police officers, and proclaims that he is an idiot for coming here to cross swords with who are essentially mob bosses running the country. Mikhail begs the player character not to make things worse, but they refuse, so Mikhail lets the protagonist into the government building anyway. Players then quickly find themselves in a Soviet Colosseum, where a crowd of jeering mobsters and oligarchs excitedly encourage the competitors to inflict violence against one another. If you keep poking away and not laying down for defeat, eventually a Russian bear comes out to kill you. Being a frickin' bear, this is of course a tough opponent, but provided you attack it from the right angles, victory is achieved and the bear is declawed. After the win, Mikhail reappears, who is sickened by the carnage, but the player character is happy with their decision, stating you can't bow down to lunatics like them. On the way to confronting them, Mikhail states that you can't imagine what they will do to us if we get caught, so proceeds to shoot himself in the head so he doesn't have to be a part of it anymore. The next section of the game is classic beat 'em up stuff, as the final stage consists of wave after wave of enemies who must be defeated within the ornate beautiful halls of the last keep. If you have played games like Streets of Rage and Final Fight, the setting will be very familiar. Hallucinations through this section begin to become stronger and stronger as the player's trips become worse and worse from the effects of their drug addiction. There is a cool part of the stage where you have to avoid a helicopter from shooting you through the building's windows, a shark room with a shark tank, lewd images of the nation's leader hanging on the walls, and more. It's all very dystopian and gets stranger by the moment. After a long and grueling stage through bedrooms and more corridors, eventually you manage to corner the nation's leader in his office. The leader tries to worm his way out of a situation, claiming he did not know the damage that the drug could do, and he just thought it was no more than a synthetic chemical he wanted to sell for national profits, claiming he is no mobster and just a politician. The protagonist says that he is going to take him out, as Vladimir said defeating him will make the whole house of cards fall down. The politician hides under the table and repeatedly calls for backup. This boss fight sees him keep trying to escape via a ladder released from a helicopter. The goal is to keep knocking him off while surviving the waves until he is eventually defeated. As usual, this is a very unique boss encounter. Eventually, the politician agrees to find common ground with the protagonist, but the drug addict at this point begins his most intense trip as of yet. Here, the beat 'em up equivalent of what I can only describe as the ending to the likes of Earthbound or Undertale takes place, where it appears that the protagonist must battle with his own addiction and inner turmoil. After the true final boss fight, a different ending occurs to the game, based on what choices the player makes within this psychedelic encounter. In both endings, when the trip concludes, it transpires that the player has massacred Russia's leader, with the security forces laying down their arms and siding with the Russian people. However, if you rely on the drug to get you through the final battle, the protagonist never wakes up from their trip. Vlad does reappear though and says he will mourn their death and remember their heroics. If drugs are not used in the final fight and the protagonist survives the trip, Vlad promises to get the hero to the hospital to flush the necro out of their system. The last scene of the game reveals that Vlad and his rebels have built a statue in the hero's honour, stating that no one has to know or care what methods he used to achieve victory, stating that all champions throughout history have bloodied hands anyway. All that matters is that they represented the downtrodden. This sees the hero admitting that they will become part of Vlad's history, even though they admit multiple times earlier in the plot that they only wanted to take out the government for personal revenge, rather than any actual motivation for the greater good, resulting in an ending designed to make gamers think and ask themselves more questions. The game would receive mixed reviews on the whole from critics, with GameSpot writing, "It may appear to be a simple brawler with retro art reminiscent of the beat-em-up golden age, but it goes much deeper. It alleviates the monotony of some of the best brawlers, it introduces wrinkles that make each level feel fresh, and it weaves complex themes into its gameplay in ways that, although not subtle, are nuanced. Mother Russia Bleeds knows how to upset many expectations of the genre. I just wish it wasn't always trying to shock me." Eurogamer would be much harsher with their analysis, concluding that the familiarity and expectedness of pixel ultra-violence has been robbed of its ability to outrage. Beyond that, this is a game that has simply swapped one set of cliches, the US-centric mean streets of Final Fight and Streets of Rage, for another, Soviet brutality and poverty. There is undeniably sport to be had there, but no redemption either for the characters, the players or the genre. PC Game would be even more dismissive of the title, writing that it perhaps says something about our collective desensitization to interactive violence, that a game in which you can uppercut a pimp's head from his torso and then use it to bludgeon a scrawny drug addict to death isn't really doing much we haven't seen before. A depressing thought at the end of this grisly little game. When the game made it over to the Nintendo Switch, Nintendo Life in 2018 would only give the game 5 out of 10 stars, writing, "Mother Russia Bleeds is a proficiently made side-scrolling beat-em-up that ultimately fails to drag this already limited genre forward with any great new ideas of its own. Add in a wearingly mature aesthetic and you're left with an oddly downbeat button-mashing action game. Fans of the genre should wait for the forthcoming Streets of Rage 4 or download Capcom's superb beat-em-up bundle." Okay, so in regards to these varied reviews, I can't say that playing it myself that violence was the main thing that I took from the experience, but rather an expertly made beat-em-up that is up there with the likes of Streets of Rage 4 and River City Girls, that simultaneously attempts to address a lot of sensitive topics that you rarely see addressed in video games. To consider Mother Russia Bleeds no more than a mindless beat-em-up is really doing this one a disservice. I personally loved this game and felt the music, style and aesthetics were different from any game in the genre I've ever played before. Maybe it is the current political climate the world is in today, but I certainly don't feel this is in any way a cookie-cutter video game like many journalists judged it to be. People have been recommending me play this game well before the recent invasion of Ukraine. Like Double Dragon Neon for me, this is one of those beat-em-ups with enough character and just the right amount of tempo to keep me coming back time and time again, and maybe even perhaps my favourite game I've played in 2022 so far. This beat-em-up is that good in my opinion, so I would love to hear your thoughts on this edgy game down below in the comment section. Videos like this are in part made possible due to the amazing people who back this channel on Patreon. Speaking of which, shoutouts go out to A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Hero Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Imar Sr., Ryan Dinch, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Azar Arkai, Jotkin Varela, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs SNK, Hermes Gonzalez, Manshovel, Michael Hall, Sang Hee, Norma Sticks, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Vladimir Renee, Marinera Liga, TOG Driver, Lewis Vian, John Bates, David Bowell, Chris Fisk, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, and everybody else who backs my work over on Patreon. It is hugely appreciated. Thank you. Yeah. Cheerio!